are. So tonight we're talking about buyer service agreements. We've been reviewing a lot of these since the start of the year with the new legislation, and I just want to make sure everybody's clear on why we're using these, how to fill them out, kind of some of the common things that you can use when you're putting these in front of your clients, some of the kind of the goods and some of the things we can do better on as we get through the rest of the year. So I've got one of the first things that I just want to make sure all of us are aware of. There is this I believe it's P8, which is a great little sheet to throw on top of a buyer service agreement. If you've not read this, this will be one that you will want to read and fine tune, especially when you get your first transaction this year, just to kind of summarize the changes as they pertain to Washington state law. So effective January 1, really the key thing for all of us here that are licensed in Washington is that we must have a buyer service agreement when we are representing a buyer. And we can kind of go into what that looks like, but before, it was kind of, some agents would use them, some agents wouldn't. It's a lot more strict as we go this year. We cannot pay out compensation for a buyer compensation unless you have a buyer service agreement. So I want to kind of run through some of the key points on that agreement so you guys know what to look for. Some of the things that we've been seeing, at least from the compliance standpoint. Jenny and I are reviewing hundreds of transactions, and I just want to make sure you're aware of what we're seeing, so we can be better out there in the industry. This is our best choice buyer brokerage service agreement. This is at least the first couple pages of it. We can take a look at it here if you need to. This is in express form, so we go up in transaction desk for some of those that are in other MLS territories other than Northwest MLS. And we have our own, and we have our own for a reason. There's a lot more protections in place. It's a lot more exhaustive than what you'll get from the standardized buyer service agreement. So I just want to make sure you guys are aware that make sure you're using the BCR form 41A, not just the 41 that's out there. There is, it's kind of funny, they had fun with the form numbers. That used to be 41A, and then when they did the forms revisions in January, they changed the numbers on people. So if you're using just MLS form 41, it is not an actual service agreement. I've seen caught a couple people with that. It needs to be an actual service agreement, which would either be the Northwest MLS 41, which is fine, but it's even better, much better for you as the agent to be using the BCR 41A. And this is what it looks like here on the screen. So we'll kind of get into this a little bit, but one of the things I wanted to just make sure everybody's aware of is, when do I have to have a buyer service agreement signed? I think I've answered this question at least half a dozen times a day with people when we're reviewing their transactions. It has to be signed and presented and signed by your clients before real estate services have been rendered. There's been a lot of debate about this in Washington state. What does that mean? When does that service start? So really kind of when it comes down to it, I'd say from an audit perspective, it just makes sure it's as soon as possible. So make sure you're introducing it in your consultations if you can, as soon as you can. But at the very, very latest, it needs to be certainly signed before the date of that purchase and sale agreement. So when I see a purchase and sale agreement dated today, I have to have a buyer service agreement either dated today or yesterday, not tomorrow, not a month from now, not 2 weeks from now. That comes up quite a bit. So I just want to make sure everybody's aware. It needs to be dated before. And that's not best choice ruling. That's not Northwest MLS. That is Washington state law. So I had one of our agents call me and ask, oh, is this just best choice that's doing this? And I was like, no, this is the law. And we have to follow the rules as we've been given starting January 1st of this year. So as soon as possible, but at the very latest, the date of the purchase and sale agreement when you're doing that. I wanted to share kind of a good success story. One of our agents, her name is Jessie. I spoke with her today. She's probably one of the best adopters, I'd say, of using the buyer service agreements. She works a lot of internet leads, a transplant to a new territory. Oops. And so here, 1 second. I'll communicate lines here. Thank you. So she works a lot with internet leads because she's transplanted to a new territory. And so what she can tell you guys from her success is that 3 out of the 4 internet leads that she comes across, and she's working a lot of internet leads in her new territory, she's having no problem introducing a service agreement. The 1 out of the 4 is either they have already worked with another agent, or, for whatever reason, they just didn't feel comfortable signing at that point in time. And she's like, no problem. So what I can tell you is the success is there. It's actually a lot easier than you think to get this in front of clients and have them successfully sign. Where she said she had a bit of a learning curve was when she was going through every single line item, little detail that was on there word for word. And she's like, there's so much that's included, especially with first-time homebuyers. She's like, I just needed to kind of go over the key points for them. So that way that they knew and they understood how I'm representing them, how I am being compensated, and what that looks like. So one of the things that she says, and I have it here on the screen, you guys can screenshot if you'd like, but she wanted to make sure when she's going through the service agreement, and if you're using the Best Choice Realty buyer brokerage service agreement, it does a really good job of starting you in this way. One of the first terms is the scope of the service. What does that mean, right? So when you get to that section, you can say, this is how I am representing you. I do more than just open doors. I go through and I help you with the paperwork. I make sure that we're running a pricing analysis on the home that you're purchasing, so you're not overpaying. I attend the inspection. I help you navigate and work with inspectors and contractors to make sure that your home buying process is nice and smooth. So this is what I'm doing. And it could be any and everything else that you're doing as part of your representation. But this is what I'm doing for you. Now, that type of, we don't work in a nonprofit. We have to get paid for our services. And, with the new laws that were put in place January 1, there's 3 great options on how to pay for my professional fee. And the choice is yours on how you want to handle it. There is a consultation, there's a retainer, and we can kind of go over what those look like. And then there's another option where we can have compensation at closing paid primarily by the seller. And that's, typically what I would prefer. You could say whatever it is that you typically or how you're wanting to handle the project with this particular buyer. But going through those options with the buyer and, outlining for them what would work or what wouldn't work is going to be most successful. And then before you can proceed and maybe show the next home, or before we can go out and show homes, I need your signature. I'm committed to work with you. I just need your commitment as well. And you can have them go through and sign that paperwork. So really good success here. And, I think one of the big key things is making sure buyers are aware that they have choices. I think right now, a lot of people feel like they're railroaded, especially if you're looking at the media that's out there. We like the element of choice. It's choices in our name. You can even say that. And there's 3 excellent choices on how to pay for our professional fees. So it's a great kind of success story I wanted to share with all of you. One of the things that come up quite a bit are the objections that come from it. The first one, I think this comes up all the time, and our buyers have gotten really smart. They know to say this now, even if they don't have representation. And, if you present something to them and say, oh, are you already working with an agent? They go, oh, I already have an agent. And that I feel like is just an objection that we all need to kind of get more clarity on and kind of understand what's your rebuttal to that, right? And this is one that I've seen has worked really well, where you say, well, you know what, that's just great. What is their name? So I can call them and give them the courtesy and let them know that I showed this home to you, that I met with you. We work in a very collaborative type of MLS, cooperative MLS. And if someone else was meeting with my client, I would certainly appreciate that phone call too. And what you'll find is it is kind of just one of those objections that they're savvy, they're smart, they know to say that. And it may be true, it may be not true, but this at least gives you the opportunity to build some more rapport, to connect with another agent and get them kind of streamlined into the new legislation. But then also just, maybe it's just not true. And they thought that they had an agent, and you go, well, once you've kind of outlined it for them in this way, they really do not have an agency agreement signed, and you can proceed at that point too. So this is probably one of the best objection responses to this type of request that we're seeing right now. Another one that comes up is, and this I would say is very pertinent to zero down programs, first time home buyers. Some of those that may be very limited in what they have cash on hand. But I don't have the money to pay you, as a buyer. And one of the best things you can say is, that's okay. I understand. By having a buyer service agreement signed between you and I, it allows for me to negotiate my professional fee to be paid for by the seller. If I don't have a signed agreement, I don't have that ability to negotiate on your behalf. So I think getting in the habit of saying that, and I think it helps to say professional fee. We had a conversation today during a mastermind training over on the east side today. And I think changing the way that we say, it's no longer, it hasn't been, even for the last year, been called commission. It's been called compensation. But retraining your brain to not say commission. It's compensation or it's professional fee. Even the 41A, it's not even an agency agreement anymore. It is a service agreement. So what does that service entail and how is that service paid for? How is that professional fee going to be paid for? So retrain, I think some of the verbiage you're using, it'll come across a lot better. You'll have better success when you're presenting this to your clients. One of the things too, our service agreement has this on the buyer agency agreement. Right? See, I even catch myself there. On the buyer service agreement, there is a rise in the use and questions that we're getting about retainers, consultations, hourly rate, options to pay for these types of professional fees. How does that work, logistically?
Right.
One of the things that you can do is have that buyer service agreement signed. So there's like literally 3 steps. Very simple. If you have a client that wants to go this route, and there may be some as we continue through the rest of the year. But have that service agreement signed, certainly. I mean, there's no way that we can match up any sort of compensation unless we have a service agreement. So once that's signed, send it to the office, and even within that same email, notify the office that an invoice needs to be sent. So that way the seller has an option to pay, and there's several ways that they could pay through that invoice once it is sent. So that's how you can handle those when they come up. And yes, there is people out there that are using it successfully. So it's not unheard of. There's just another way of doing it if that's something that works for that particular client or
Washington 527 South.
Some of the common issues I've been seeing in our buyer service agreements since the start of the year, that these are there's four blunders, I would say, that we've been trying to unravel and fix as we go through the rest of the year. But this is kind of like the what not to do list if you guys are putting these together. The limited dual agency section used to be called just dual agency. It's now called limited dual agency. If you are truly, or if you have any plan or intention to represent 2 parties in a transaction, buyer and seller, limited dual agency needs to be authorized by both of those parties. So what we're seeing and kind of coming across is that a listing agreement was signed and they didn't initial that section. Well, they end up having a buyer where the buyer authorized it, but maybe the seller didn't during that initial listing paperwork. So making sure if you are truly representing both parties that authorization has been initialed by both of them. So that's something that's come up a couple times that we've had to fix. And one of the other things is not having a buyer service agreement at all. This is something that is very firm just because of the new legislation. We've been asking for buyer service agreements for several years at this point as part of our managing broker reviews on your transactions, but now it's just the law. We have to have it. So it's not just Shannon's law dictating to you. This is Washington state law. We have to have a buyer service agreement. So making sure that you have that when you are representing a client. One of the other kind of tied in with that is having the start date of the buyer service agreement or the date of the buyer's initials dated after the date of the purchase and sale agreement. It's kind of go hand in hand, but it's kind of one of those no-nos. We don't want to be seeing stuff like that. There likely will be a little bit of grace. I can't promise that, but there likely will be a little grace as we're getting used to the new legislation the last couple months. But moving forward, auditors, I've been audited many, many times in the last year. They don't care. So they want to see the dates match up properly. They don't care about, oh, I didn't know. They are very firm on the legislation and how the rules are done. The last thing, and we've been seeing this quite a bit recently, is buyer's agents are indicating zero in compensation on their buyer service agreements. It's not helpful for you guys to be putting zero. The reason for that is there's no way for us as a brokerage to back you up. There's basically there's no compensation if you're representing a buyer and the seller ended up was in that scenario where they didn't offer any sort of compensation. Technically, you would owe the firm compensation, that would have to be paid directly from the buyer in that scenario. And it's not doing you any favors. It's not doing you any good. Don't leave it blank. Either leave it blank and leave it in the defaults, but try not to indicate zero whenever possible. It's not helping you in terms of the way that it's drafted in that way. It's not intended to be that way. What I typically am telling people when they're filling out this form, for most scenarios, this tends to work, that indicate the minimum amount you would charge your buyer in the event that seller offered no compensation for the buyer. So, I mean, that could be a flat fee, that could be an hourly rate, that could be a consultation, or it could be a percentage, but just indicate the minimum amount for that type of compensation there. So I think that's everything I wanted to cover really fast. I know we've got a little bit of time for questions, just because I know that we get a lot about these types of scenarios. So I think, Candace, is there anything that I missed maybe that we need to just check on real fast, or anything that you've gotten through chats or questions from people in the last week?
No, that was the big one. And it was, yeah, that was the big one. It was a question actually I had today. The most recent one that you mentioned is some agents are just putting in zero on the, on the compensation amount. Zero. Yeah. And that does you no justice if you need to. So reiterating at least the minimum that you would accept if they were not, but putting zero is not helping at all.
Yep, I know. And for you too, Candace, I mean, just so we can kind of get a reference too, are you having problems with getting buyer service agreement signed?
Not at all. Not at all. I literally just recently had a client who I was working with back in 2021, totally gave up on the process. It was, bidding war after bidding war, and he was just fit to be tied. So he reached out to me. I sat down with him and explained the agency agreement. It was interesting because he had already heard a lot of information. And his question to me is this the thing that starts in July? And I'm like, no, this is actually something that started January 1. I need to be able to enter into an agreement with you just like sellers do. In the past, it was not a requirement. It's currently law. And we went in further to the conversation and discussed, what does this mean? What it means is that you're committed to me just as I'm committed to getting you into a home, and that you're going to work with me exclusively. And it was nothing. It was nothing at all. We went over the section of the 3%, which was filled in. And I did explain to him, does not necessarily mean that I'm going to charge you 3%. My goal has always been, and it will be, continue to be, that I am negotiating the compensation paid to me by the seller. However, in the unlikely event that that doesn't happen, this may be required that you pay this amount, or we negotiate an amount that you would pay me if for any reason there is no compensation. So we had a great conversation. He's like, oh, you're great, and I know we're going to get into a home, and I'm no concern about it. Signed on the dotted line, done. Piece of cake.
Yeah, I know. It's a lot simpler than I think a lot of us think it is. We're not the first state to enter into this type of arrangement. We're actually kind of behind the ball in terms of entering buyer service agreements. There's many other states across the United States that have already had this for many years. And so don't overthink it too much.
Right.
We had a question, so the VA, so for VA, there are zero down programs, unless they're, putting other types of funds down into into their loan. But yeah, the VA doesn't allow for compensation to be paid for from the VA loan program. So having a compensation indicated on the buyer service agreement is how you're going to negotiate that to be paid for by the seller. Right now, they're not allowing that to be done. So we have to kind of have that, especially with VA, have a service agreement in place. Another one that I think we had recently from a couple agents was talking about the compensation, how it's displayed. So what's funny actually about buyer compensation is that it depends on where you're at. Northwest MLS has already been very transparent in all how they handle the display of buyer compensation for years. Ever since 2019, there was a big hullabaloo, it was all in the media, all in the news about the display of that compensation. And, so recently it's kind of come up again, with all the stuff in the news again. From what I can gather, it has not changed. Northwest MLS has not changed how they are displaying that information. Other MLSs may have different stances, depending on what is being dictated to them by the National Association of Realtors. So, as far as Northwest MLS goes and is concerned, it's still displaying that information. I just checked this morning. Let's see, another question we got, and Candace, you may be able to help me with this one too. How do you handle a situation where the buyer does not want to commit to paying a percentage or any money for buyer services? They're always expecting seller to pay or negotiate accordingly. I think in this scenario, and Candace, you can kind of chime in here too, but we've got to indicate something. And having a percentage or a dollar amount or a consultation allows for us to have that negotiated by the seller. We have to have something. We can't just put zero.
Right. I mean, that's exactly it. It's like by you signing this is exactly it. Otherwise, without it, I can negotiate it if I want to. And I completely understand that you would not want to pay any, and we are under the conclusion that I will be negotiating with the seller to pay. Now, if for any reason there is something that's not paying compensation, we need to have that conversation so that that this might be very challenging scenario. And
one
maybe,
question.
and
Sorry, Candace, Shannon, sorry for the interruption. Just a quick question. If the buyer raises an objection because I'm putting a dollar percentage in there, say 3%, right? And they're like, somebody else is willing to go 0%, but they're going to do the same thing. Say eventually they're going to negotiate with a Form 40 at the time of the offer or whatever it is. Will it put us in a disadvantageous situation if we try to convince them to put a 3% now? And somebody else is going to go 0%, and eventually they're all going to negotiate anyway, and seller's going to pay for the compensation no matter what. I'm just trying to ask.
Yeah, so I mean that's part of the new forms starting in January is it has on there, it's very clear within the legislation, but also within the buyer service agreement, the listing service agreement, everything. The commission is negotiable. So for you, I mean, if you're trying to compete against another buyer's agent that's out there, you can charge what you want to charge. The buyer can pay what they're willing to pay, but at the end of the day, it comes down to what you're willing to take on for that type of project. If you're putting in let's say, for instance, said you put in a 2% or 1%, but then the listing, the listing agreement that's broadcasted on Northwest MLS is only showing 0.5% or no commission. In that situation, what are we going to do? We're going to have to negotiate with the seller to pay for the difference. If you put in a certain amount, it can always go up. I think the way that it's read within the service agreement, you can kind of read underneath. So there's the three different options. And then I think it's like term D and E. You can kind of read those, but it talks about kind of those different scenarios about what if it's 4%? What if it's 2%? You can kind of go through some of those different sections there. And yeah, Rochelle just put a note, you can always amend the buyer service agreement. So just like a listing agreement, we have a Form 18 for that, where we can amend it. We can do an amendment to a buyer service agreement too. So it's certainly an option. I would say probably call Rochelle, Candace, or I before you do something like that. But that's something that is an option as well. Perfect. Let's see. And then Abby had a question. Yeah, you can negotiate with the buyer too. Yeah. So, yeah, commission is negotiable.
Yeah.
You'll just use that on the service agreement, for listings and for buyers. Um,
And I think also think there's something to point out is like, we may literally be looking at, well, for now, we may be looking at what that compensation is being offered at the time of every property that we're reviewing, and have our decision then when we write it up, because at that point I'm writing this offer, it's pay as offered or other, and I've got to make a selection. So as I'm writing up your offer, so that's another time that we are communicating, we're discussing.
yeah. I had one of our agents out east that's asking, they're in a different MLS than Northwest MLS. And in those areas, they're pulling off the display and transparency of buyer's agent compensation. So should this happen, I mean, the advice we give now might be different than the advice 6 months from now, depending on what ends up happening, within the legal world that there is. But when there is no compensation that's listed on a listing, how is that handled? So let's say I'm representing a seller and the seller has decided not to offer any compensation to the buyer. This has, I know, been circulating a lot in the chats on Facebook, on social media, basically all on social media. So, and Candace, you kind of think about this too. How do we handle that type of communication with the seller's agent, with the seller? There is an addition, so hopefully you've got a service agreement signed by your buyer, so we can certainly negotiate in that respect. There should be some sort of service agreement in place. But in terms of how that works on the paperwork side, if there was no compensation listed on the first page of the purchase and sale agreement where it talks about the buyer's agent compensation, it's like one of the last terms is on the first page of the purchase and sale agreement. It has a percentage or a dollar amount listed, and then it has two boxes. One will say pay as offered, and the other will say other, see addendum. The moment you see no compensation listed, rather than just like writing your offer and just going to town with it, I would pick up the phone. That would be my advice to you. Pick up the phone, have a conversation with the agent before you even show it even, and talk about that. Is it a for sale by owner? Is it, what's prompting that? Maybe they just didn't post it. I mean, what is causing that type of circumstance? Then you'll have a little bit more that you're armed with when you write the offer. But regardless, if you're negotiating for your compensation to be paid for by the seller, you'll be using the 41C as in cat, 41C. And that form kind of clearly indicates how the compensation will be paid for, how much, and all of that jazz. So take a look at that if you're in that circumstance. But that's how it's handled when it's not displayed. Which some territories are doing that right now. Not Northwest MLS, but some of the other areas right now are pulling some of that information off. Yeah, and I feel you. Atomic Egg, I feel you. I feel really bad for brand new buyer agents having to negotiate for their compensation. Yeah, I saw a post recently. I don't know if you guys are Shark Tank lovers like I am. I love Shark Tank. But Barbara Corcoran, who posted the other day talking about the real estate industry at large, and she was talking about how, we are in sales and real estate and the whole industry as a whole, we are resilient. And this is another storm that we will weather, just like we did back in 2019 when they started posting things publicly too. I think there's another quote out there that says, this too will pass. And we'll get through it, and it's all about how we speak to it. I think one of the big things that I think is helpful for some people is to don't get stuck in the chats and in the social media. It's maybe not really good for your psyche. It's good to be aware of what's going on, but it's best not to linger. So when we linger, that's when we're not able to stay productive in real estate. So take that little advice. I'd say if you have questions, I'd say go ahead and ask them in the chat. I know we've got a very active little Facebook group. You're welcome to go to town and ask people questions if people are handling certain circumstances differently, but try not to linger and then we can move forward on there. I think that's all the questions we had. I know 30 minutes goes by fast. If you have other pertinent questions, I know our numbers are here on the screen. You're welcome to call Candace and I, Rochelle. We actually have a new addition to our team too. Her name is Virginia. You're welcome to call her as well, and we can help you with navigating some of these unique circumstances. So yeah, reach out to us there if we can help you further. I'd be happy to. I certainly get at least half a dozen a day. And we can kind of go from there. So thanks, you guys. Oh, I had a question. Okay, who had a question here?
Thank you.
Can agent compensation be paid for the buyer be rolled into the mortgage? You'll want to talk to your lender. Odds are no. I have not been seeing that being done recently, but you can certainly talk to the lender, see what's allowable. I'd say right now we're seeing probably more buy downs than agent compensation in that respect. Sid, if that answers your question. Okay,
Yeah,
perfect. I
thanks.
think that's everything. Thanks, you guys. Good luck this week. And then we've got, I believe, a listing training tomorrow. If those of you who are trying to take some listings or wanting to take some more listings this year, I know we've got an excellent training on Tuesday. And then we've got forms. So if you want kind of a more in-depth information on buyer service agreements, the new Washington State forms that kind of got published January 1 as part of that revision, come in on Friday and we can talk more about that as well. Then if not, I guess I'll see you guys this next Monday. Thanks, you guys.